Sir, you start off and everyone starts standing.
I should just quit when I'm ahead.
So we heard today there's a premier, there's an ambassador, there's state legislators, there is ministers, speakers, but one right honorable. And so I'm just going to call you Mr. Prime Minister.
Appreciate that. That's what we love about the Americans. You keep the titles. Great to be here. Always great to be back in Saskatchewan, which in my political lifetime, the last generation, since 2007, has become, I think, probably the most dynamic part of the country. Saskatoon, the business capital. Great to be here. Thanks for your words, Your Worship. Thanks for the introduction, Ken. Much appreciated. It's great to see you again. I saw you in Calgary. I saw you in India. I'm seeing you here. And I'm hearing your one-year-old daughter. I hope I can improve her mood in what I say.
She's excited to hear you, so. Mr. Harper, Mr. Prime Minister, as I was prepared for this today, I actually thought about a conversation I had with President Lai of Taiwan last year. And I got to meet him, and this was just shortly after his inauguration, and he made the comment to me, where are you from? And I actually thought he'd be briefed. I'm from Canada, but maybe he got confused when he looked at me. I was too tall, maybe too brown, but he then quickly said, "You have good neighbors." And I just got a glimpse of so many parts of the world do not have good neighbors. And I just thought of the plight that he experiences. And then I actually thought back to our amazing neighbor to the south of us and how good a neighbor we actually do have when you look at the world. And so I actually wanted, you are right honorable, you're Prime Minister, you got to have a great working relationship with President Bush, President Obama. Maybe give us some stories or insights to 500 of your closest friends here, of course.
Yeah. So, look, it's interesting you say that. We sometimes forget it because we take it for granted. Prime Minister Netanyahu once said to me, Canada's the best position in the world in terms of security. Oceans on three sides, the United States of America on the other. He says, now you compare my position. We won't get into that. But, you usually be reminded of that. I've always thought one of the great assets of this country is our, having the United States as our great, really our only neighbor and our critical partner and ally. I think it's been a great asset for this country. I hope that will continue. But look, it's always something we shouldn't take for granted. You asked me about the two presidents. I just completed a draft of my memoirs. Now, I have to be honest, all the best stories can't go in. They really can't.
That's why we're here.
I'm thinking someday maybe I should just do like Margaret Thatcher, write them for when I die. Look, I'll just say this, and I've said it before. President Bush, President Obama, very different people, different agendas. But, we were 99% aligned because Canada and the U.S. are aligned on the important global issues. I was very different people, but I was never in a room, a summit, where the American president, either one of them, was not one of the best, if not the best, briefed and articulate people in the room. And I thought we did some very good things together. Canada was, at the time of President Bush, he was obviously a president focused on security, especially after 9/11. In my time, we were a significant contributor to the mission in Afghanistan, the multilateral mission, and unfortunately, as some of you may remember, at one point we had the highest per capita casualty rate of any allied country there. So it was a difficult but a meaningful contribution that we made. President Obama came after the global financial crisis, more focused on the economy. We did a number of great things on, with Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, border negotiations. It was actually a Canadian who, under President Obama, was actually a Canadian commander who led the mission to Libya. And of course, we worked with President Obama very closely on the global response to Ebola in West Africa, making sure it did not become a global pandemic. So, you know, look, we just had, and I always say this to my Canadian colleagues and particularly First Ministers. You know, we're always going to have irritants between our countries, but what's really important is, I think whether the United States likes it or not, the United States has a leadership role in the world, and it's really important as a Canadian that before you get to the list of grievances, you see, you know, how can we be of assistance in that leadership role?
So you spoke of at some of these multilateral events. You know, you've been to many of those over your tenure, and you even hosted a G8 and a G20. Where does the work actually get done? Does it happen on the sidelines or actually in the room?
So I think there's a misunderstanding about summits generally. There's kind of an expectation, it's kind of a media thing. You have a summit and like, what are the deliverables? What have you decided? What's happening? And, you know, and sometimes those things happen, but I think the truth of the matter is that for a lot of our summits, especially those with our closest partners and allies, I actually think there's way too much emphasis on, you know, some specific achievement. The real purpose is meeting and being in contact and discussing ongoing issues and having a close working relationship and understanding with your international partners. I mean, obviously, you know, there were times like the global financial crisis when President Bush called us all to the White House after that, where, you know, people were frantically hammering out plans of action for dealing with that. Most of the time, those things are decided beforehand, except, you know, some very controversial things which will come up at the meeting itself. But I say most of the time, my view of the value of it was really the ongoing working relationship and partnerships.
I should just remind folks that if everyone should have an app for this conference, and you're able to input your questions under this session into the app, and we'll try to get through to a couple of those near the end. Prime Minister Harper, you've been a fierce advocate of free trade throughout your entire career, and have fought almost against protectionism. How do you look at the current world in terms of the protectionistic tendencies that are creeping in? And then two, is free trade now passé?
Well, look, I'm obviously concerned about what's happening. And look, just to be clear, I wrote about this in my book, Right Here, Right Now. You know, there are very few trade relationships in the world that are purely free trade. You know, countries do want to protect things. They do have national security interests, these sorts of things. But that said, we tried to greatly liberalize trade, and we'll talk maybe a bit later about what we did in my term of office. We created almost all of Canada's modern trade agreements except USMCA. Look, that has been the basis of post-war peace and growing prosperity around the world. Now, I do think some really serious mistakes have been made along the way. And, you know, the mistakes along the line of just because you are for liberalized trade, that, you know, the assumption that means that any kind of trade deal is a good deal. And the most infamous, I don't mind saying, is really the terms on which the West, the United States, and ourselves and other allies, the terms on which we admitted China to the World Trade Organization, which essentially allowed China to conduct, in the name of free trade, a neo-mercantilist trade policy. Their policy has not been about the mutual benefits of free trade. It's been about accumulating surpluses at the expense of other countries and using those for geostrategic objectives, competitive objectives. And, you know, and that, you know, when they can sell to us and we can barely sell to them, like, that's not a liberalized trade agreement. And it was a big mistake, and there have been some others. So, you know, when President Trump says there's some trade relationships that have to be fixed, some national security considerations have to be brought in, and in particular the China thing, and there's some others, there have to be better reciprocal access. That's all true. But you know, it should be under no illusion. Like I'm an economist, and I'm actually now, you know, my specialty was fiscal policy and economic history, and comprehensive protectionism. You know, the idea of using tariff barriers to raise revenue and relocate, comprehensively relocate industries, like this is a failed economic policy where it has been tried. And so I am worried about that general direction. I don't think everybody's going there, though. I don't think this country will ever go there.
So you mentioned your focus on trade and trade deals while you were Prime Minister. You know, not everyone's always on the same page. How do you balance the interest of the country with the priorities of other nations as you get to those deals?
Well, you know, we're sort of indirectly talking about President Trump and the Art of the Deal, which is a good book, by the way. But, you know, actually, I did in my career, a bunch of political deals and trade deals, and now I do business deals. And I actually think I'm a pretty good deal maker. And the key to deal making is win-win. Like, that's really the key to deal making. When I hear people say that the idea of a deal is they can get up on a podium and explain how the other guy lost, like that's actually not how you make a deal. I always used to say, never made a deal with, I never made a deal with anybody without, first of all, trying to understand him before I got to the bargaining table, what the other guy really wanted and needed. And then being able to, on the day we announced the deal, political, trade, whatever, being able to say not just why we won, but why he won too. And so I just think that's really, that's a really critical lesson that I'm worried is slipping through fingers these days.
So one of the trade deals you're working on was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which really ties in a lot of the emerging markets of the world. What's your sense of those as they're really developing and growing?
Yeah, look, you know, as you know, what was really funny about this is the whole Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations were driven by the United States, by the Obama administration, quite aggressively, to the point where we were compelled to announce the conclusion of the deal during my 2015 federal election campaign. Not ideal timing, but it actually worked out. It actually, in the end, worked out pretty well. And then, of course, the U.S. ultimately didn't join. And just to be fair, because people say, you know, Trump pulled us out, but actually, I think the deal was dead when Hillary Clinton, who was the Democratic nominee, the successor of Obama, also came out against the deal. So that kind of killed the United States participation. But to my surprise, what then happened was Prime Minister Abe, who was the next biggest partner of Japan, he really led it forward, and ultimately they, you know, basically, you know, modified the package for the fact that the United States was no longer in and got it done as what they called the CPTPP. So, look, I think it's an important. It's important, even if the United States is not in it. It's important to have a liberalized trade area, not dominated by China. This was, besides the mutual gains from trade, this was one of the strategic objectives of the negotiations. And even without the United States, I think it's important to note that even without the United States, other parties, Japan, Australia, Canada, et cetera, ultimately recognized that it was necessary for it to go ahead on that basis.
You mentioned we were in India earlier this year, and you have been in India, I think, at least once every year since being in office.
More than once, yeah.
Sometimes several times. So you talk about China, and the counterbalance in many ways is India. Maybe just share, why do you keep coming back? Why do you keep going? And then two is, what are you most excited about India?
Well, look, we had a great relationship with India when I was Prime Minister and did the, you know, the uranium sales deal, nuclear cooperation. We had important for the province of Saskatchewan. We just great relationships with India, and why did I keep going? I like to say I went there partly because in India I was admired for my sense of fashion.
You actually
Canadians will know what that's about. But no, look, I go there because look, the world right now. I don't sugarcoat things. Like the world right now is a pretty troubled place on a lot of fronts: geopolitical, environmental, economic, obviously military. There aren't a lot of really, really good news stories in the world right now, and one of them is India. You know, India is one of the rare countries, democratic countries these days, that has, whether you like Modi or do not like Modi, a leader who's in a strong political position and moving his country forward in a very clear direction. And that's not that common these days. It's, you know, the Indian economy is booming. Now it's very uneven, but overall booming. And I have been saying, I've been saying for 20 years, I was a minority 20 years ago, less of a minority now, saying that India is the better longer-term bet than China, because I just think that over time, democracies create better, balanced, more inclusive, sustainable growth patterns. That's my view. Nobody thought that 20 years ago. People, I think, are starting to come around on that. But look, it's a booming place. I say rare in the world. Very difficult still to do business in, but a rule of law environment. And I do think longer term, because it is a democratic nation, it will not be an ally like, you know, North America and Western Europe, but it will be a more aligned country in the future, what I think is going to be an increasingly difficult world.
You mentioned fashion, and you happened to be at the wedding of the decade last year in India. Maybe just in terms of the geopolitical draw and the business draw to an event like that, just shows sometimes the difference that, you know, India even 20 years ago would have.
Yeah, I was at the $1 billion Ambani wedding. And, you know, normally going to kind of purely social events is not my thing, but I just couldn't pass this one up. And I've gotten to know the Ambanis a little bit in business and actually do some work with their research institute. Look, people ask me, what's a $1 billion wedding like? You know, you have to be there to, when they build entire hotels and arenas just for the wedding. But I'll just give you one little flavor, which was when they had the formal, I think it was the formal religious ceremony part. And this is the second, by the way, there was second of 3 weddings. I was invited the first 2, the third one was a small family affair. So I was at the second, which was the biggest one, which is like 3,000 or 4,000 people. And I'm in this very, you know, this kind of VIP area they had for the religious ceremony. And I don't know Bollywood very well, but I thought a couple seats over, I thought, that's a Bollywood star I kind of recognize. So I took out my phone and I Googled Bollywood stars. And then I realized every single one of them was sitting around me, every single one. And Kim Kardashian, a bunch of other people. So anyway, it was quite something. I'm lowering my daughter's expectations, though, for any kind of wedding.
Just another day in the life of. Mr. Prime Minister, when you look...
This is a good thing about being former Prime Minister. You could do this kind of stuff. Couldn't do this as Prime Minister. You know, the government would have made me pay for my travel and everything, but anyway.
True. So one of the things that's been interesting, this resonates with a lot of legislators here. they feel that. They feel that.
It can be pretty good out of office, actually. Don't kid yourself.
One of the things that's been interesting is that in May, for the 4 consecutive months, trade with the U.S. has actually gone down from Canada, including that month, it went up 5.7% to other parts of the world. So I wanted to get your perspective on what's the longer-term view in terms of trade from Canada, and then also what would you want to tell our American colleagues here?
Yeah, look, really good question. You know, you have to be careful about interpreting too much from month-to-month data because there's a lot of noise, a lot of natural fluctuation in that. I think we all are aware, certainly anybody in the airline hospitality business is aware of the decline in Canadian vacation travel to the United States. It's been very dramatic. look, I'm just gonna put it in this context, just so everyone understands. You know, I think it's fair to say, probably the most pro-American prime minister, Canadian history. And I tell people that if a year ago the government had asked me, you know, President Trump's coming in, he's talking about, you know, big challenges on trade, USMCA, tariffs, what would you advise? I would have said a year ago, this is a real opportunity for Canada to really deepen its economic and security partnership with the United States. However, when this government did actually ask me a few weeks ago my advice was the opposite. My advice was, yes, you know, on the economy, we've got to kind of get something short-term worked out with the Trump administration, but this really is a wake-up call for this country to truly diversify its trade export markets. That's why, you know, that's why we did sign the trade deals all around the world, Europe, Asia, Pacific, the Americas. And Canada has been, to be blunt, this is, you know, nothing against the U.S. The reality is, independent of the current disputes, Canada has been, to use business term, and I'm in the investment business now, we have been grossly overweight the United States as a country. And there is no reason for that. Just because we have that geographic proximity does not justify the degree of dependence that we have on a single market, which is sometimes disadvantageous. And the other thing, you know, in terms of security, my advice to the government is, yes, absolutely, spend more on defense. We should have been doing it all along. But while we spend a lot more in defense, while the border is a shared responsibility, let's make sure we spend a lot more on defense so that we can be independently responsible for our own land, seas, and skies, independent of the United States. And I'm just going to tell you right now, one political role I still have, I chair the Global Federation of Conservative Parties, and I can tell you that this is the advice every allied capital is getting from everybody like me that they talk to. And this is not ideal, but I just think it's a reality. The cat's out of the bag. You can't, or toothpaste is out of the tube, whatever you want to call it. You can't put it back. And I think it's unfortunate. I think in the long term, this direction will weaken the free world more than it will help it, and it will, I think, ultimately weaken the United States as well. So I think it's unfortunate, but that is the reality of the situation that we have to deal with.
So we have state legislators and, you know, provincial leaders here. At the subnational level, what can they do to move things forward?
Well, look, I think what, you know, I'm not going to tell you anything that anybody in this room doesn't already know. I think it's just try and bring the facts to bear, you know, on Washington, and for that matter, on our own government, although, to be frank, well, the outcome of the election wasn't what I want. I think the current government does, you know, get it better than their predecessors. Just the fact of how, look, the biggest thing is this, I'm talking this from the Canadian perspective. I mean, for the United States, and I'll tell you that, I've told this to American audience, for the United States, like, understand that Canada is your largest, most balanced, and most lucrative trade arrangement in the entire world, by a lot, by a lot. And it's not just a trade relationship. As you know, in the Midwest, the prairies, this is not trade. This is just total mutual, total economic integration for the benefit of industries of all kinds and services on both sides of the border. And frankly, you know, it's, by international comparisons, it's virtually tariff-free. Like, I don't know what it is that we're trying to fix here. Of course, we can always tinker with things, but, you know, it's, as I say, it's a relationship that could actually be deeper, but unfortunately, I don't think that's the direction it's going to head. But let's make sure that everybody understands. If one government is legislating against industries on one side of the border, they're probably hurting industry on the same side of the border. That's just the reality of the depth of this relationship. And it's not just, as was said earlier, it's not just the trade relationship. I mean, this is a deep social and cultural relationship. Look, my own family tree, my ancestors were loyalists from the American Revolution. On the other hand, when I look at, my family tree over the generations, 7, 8 generations now with my kids, like almost half of that family tree are American. One of my very distant cousins was a General Harper who was a senior military commander in the post-war period in the United States. So these are just very deep relations, and sometimes like independent of what's happened recently. What all Americans need to understand, I know it's not so much when you're border states, we're close to each other, we always get each other, but Canadians are always expressing, I like to tell the story, Canadians are always expressing concern about, we really don't get the attention in Washington we deserve based on the size of the relationship. And I like to quote the former president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Tom Donahue, and he said, first time I ever met him, he said, Prime Minister, this is the problem you're going to have. As important as this relationship is, in security and economic and everything else, you never get the attention you deserve in Washington. In fact, not only do you not get attention, you get taken for granted and sometimes just inadvertently slighted. And he said, you've got to understand what the reason for that is. The reason for that is, as Americans, we don't really think of Canada as a foreign country. We think of you as like a neighbor, almost part of the family. And that's how we treat family. So.
I think that's good. Prime Minister Harper, as you heard Minister Carr talk about energy, and this idea of energy security, food security keeps coming up. When you look at this region that's represented with this body, pretty important to not just this continent, but the world.
Yeah, Canadian energy is vital to the United States. We are for America, we're your largest imports of energy by far come from Canada, and in some cases, certain parts of the U.S. energy industry are extremely dependent on it, and we sell it to you at a discount to world price, which is just stupidity on our part, but that's what we do. We need to change that. Energy, critical minerals, which are pretty nascent in Canada, which we have a potential abundance of. Energy, potash, uranium, going to be obviously bigger, critical minerals. These are, all things that I think the United States will not be entirely independent on for the foreseeable future, which it will need Canadian imports. But just to be clear, given what has happened, Canada must be seized with the necessity of making sure that we do not export only to you. That's really critical for us going forward. We just cannot be in a position in the future where we can be threatened in this way and not have that leverage.
So this is also in the context of some major wars going on, Russia and Ukraine, of course, and then there's the Middle East. So how do, there's the trade, and then there's even just logistics of movement of goods, right? Ships are having to divert, planes are not able to go over certain airspace. So how do you see these things, the confluence of these things come together?
Well, a lot of these things have a lot worse impact on other parts of the world than here.
Absolutely.
Obviously, Europe, the energy insecurity that's been created, but what is really missed, especially in the Russia-Ukraine war, is the degree to which agriculture and some other vital supplies have really been disrupted to the emerging economies. This has been a big problem for them, and one of the reasons why some of them are less supportive of the Allied effort than we would like them to be. But this is, once again, this is an opportunity for Canada, for Saskatchewan, to drive home the reality that we are and can be even more so a safe, rule of law supplier of these critical resources around the world. We are not just a rule of law environment, we are the farthest away you can be in the world from all of the conflict zones. And that's a real strategic advantage for us, provided, of course, we have a federal government that wants to get the stuff out of the ground and sell it. And we'll see, Premier, I'm optimistic that that will change.
I'll go to an audience question here. What is the best path for reframing or improving the unique Canada-U.S. relationship?
Well, look, I think on our side, I'll say two things. I don't mind saying them. On our side, obviously, look, Canadians, Americans should understand, Canadians are a combination of just angry and bewildered by what is happening here. And that is very real, and it is very deep, and it is across the country, and it is across the political spectrum. But, what can we do on our side? I go back to what, I said earlier, to frankly what one of my predecessors, Brian Mulroney, was very good at. And that is, finding ways to be an important partner of the United States around the world. And I don't think that was done in the last decade, to be honest, or not done the way it should have been done, particularly with the first Trump administration. So look, we should look for ways beyond trade to be helpful. Look, on the American side, if you don't mind me saying to our American friends here, I really do hope that a realization seeps into the United States. And look, the United States is still by any measure the most powerful country in the world. And it is also, I think by any measure, the most desirable major partner, not just for Canada, but for most countries in the world. But there is a view taking hold in the present administration that I would say that sort of sees the world as, everybody needs America, but America doesn't need anybody. And like I tell you, that's not true. That just isn't true. I said that, the Trump administration is completely right to deal with some of its trade challenges, but declaring a trade war on 200 other countries at the same time? I mean, come on. Like, that's not how you move the ball forward long term. So, I hope some realizations will click in, that some people will, some of the countries will become better allies. A lot of allies have not been good allies, so some countries become better allies, including ourselves. And we can get through this. But at the same time, as I say, Victor, and I'm being very candid here, this can't be forgotten. The reality now that we have not faced as a country in 100 years of seeing the United States flex its muscles in a way that has nothing to do with values or ideals, that is something we can't forget. And we cannot make ourselves entirely dependent on that relationship.
Here's another question from the floor. What do you see as the most challenging or dangerous geopolitical situation currently threatening the West?
So there are, I think, three theaters that really matter. There are basically three major revisionist powers in the world threatening kind of the American Western-led world order. Obviously, there are Iran, and here I think the administration has been, absolutely right, working with its Israeli and, to a lesser degree, Arab allies to, eliminate Iran's broader regional threat in the Middle East and ultimately decapitate its nuclear weapons program. I think the administration deserves a lot of credit for this. I have been saying for 15 years at least that the single biggest threat of nuclear war was Iran ever getting a nuclear weapon. And I had told American administrations confidentially for years, it was my conclusion the only way to ever stop that would be military action. And so it's been done, and I think it will continue to be done if necessary. So I think that will, and I think you'll see, I do think you'll see the, with Iran kind of out of the picture or cut down to size, I think you'll see a broadening of good relations in that part of the world, and a lot of the insurgencies toned down. So I think that's on a good track. Russia, Ukraine, I don't know what to say about Russia, Ukraine. I think Americans understand, like, there's never been any division of opinion in Canada on this issue. Putin is a dangerous expansionist bully. Ukraine is not a perfect country, but Ukraine is an ally and a friend. And I just hope I've watched Vladimir Putin, in fairness to President Trump, I've watched Vladimir Putin deal with one American president after another and almost kind of try to convince them at the front end that somehow he'll work with them, and then realize at time that he never will. It's just important for the United States to realize that, like, forget about Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is an enemy of the United States. He lives, eats, and breathes to dismantle American power in the world. And the sooner the United States comes around to that full realization and puts its shoulder back to the wheel, we can stop, we hopefully prevent Ukraine from falling, but certainly stop Putin's adventurism, because it's a big threat to everybody, especially Europe. But then the third one is, which is not a hot war, but is the situation with China, and particularly Taiwan. And, I just think it's so important that the United States and the world continue to present a real threat of deterrence from any Chinese notion of taking Taiwan. Because if China were to take Taiwan, that would be, or there were to be a war across the strait, Taiwanese Strait, I mean, that would be a geopolitical problem that would dwarf, it would absolutely dwarf anything we're seeing in the Middle East or in Ukraine. And it would be a major geopolitical catastrophe for the world. So hopefully, I say, all of the allies will continue to do enough to deter China from that kind of adventurism.
Here's an interesting question. Which global leader, whether ally or rival, left the strongest impression on you, and why?
So, yeah, I'll say, I try in my memoirs to really say good things about people or not say much at all.
We're anticipating this now.
So on the good stuff, look, he's not that well known here, but people may remember that I'm the only person to come to the Prime Minister's office in Canadian history through a third party. So the consequence of that was I had virtually nothing in the way of mentors, and the closest thing I had to a mentor was Prime Minister John Howard of Australia. And he was a fantastic leader, led for a decade, just left his country in such fantastic condition that 10 years of complete chaos afterwards, still this country was still strong. He was a great person, a great leader. So that's a guy I have deep affection for. Just had his 86th birthday on the weekend, so we were chatting. But look, I do make the odd exception, and I do talk a lot about Vladimir Putin in my memoirs. I get asked more about, I tell people, of all the people I've met in the world, and I met not just political leaders, artists and movie stars and business leaders, I get asked more about Vladimir Putin, meeting Vladimir Putin, than any single person in the world.
But didn't you also famously personally call him out in 2014?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so that was, like, not many people, like, literally personally call him out.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't accept a drink from him or anything like that. But look, so why is that? And I think it's because, like, Vladimir Putin is a real life Bond villain. Like, he really is. Except I never saw any sense of humor, although one of my colleagues he did say one time he heard Putin laughing at a very macabre joke. But No, let me just tell you a bit about Putin, though. Vladimir Putin is in many ways, notwithstanding, and he and I, had a notoriously bad relationship by the end, quite deliberate on my part, actually. But he's, in many ways, a very impressive individual. Vladimir Putin is very smart. He is very smart. He is very hardworking. He's extremely disciplined. He would come into any meeting I ever saw just fantastically well briefed. And he is a real, psychological expert. He's a, former intelligence officer. And I watched Vladimir Putin. He was very good at sizing up people's weaknesses and exploiting them and getting them to think he was on their side when he wasn't. I watched this over and over again with this guy. And I started, by the way, I publicly called him out, but privately at the end I was calling him out on this stuff all the time and quite getting under his skin, actually, which I enjoyed. Look, and so he has a lot of great attributes. And the problem is, though, that, this big problem, he's an evil man. He took what is a fledgling democracy and turned it back into a tyranny. He is creating no institutions, no long-term plan for Russia. He will leave the country poor and in chaos when he goes. And I think this is a real tragedy for Russia. And in a sense, it's a tragedy that somebody with his ability just wasn't imbued with any sense of ideals or higher purpose.
That's quite the statement. If you were designing a Canada-U.S. Midwest partnership from scratch today, what's one or bold, unexpected idea you would include? It's from the audience.
Yeah. So I think I had a really good answer. I'd be starting a business. No, look, I just think on the Canadian side, it's the obvious one. It's getting these critical minerals out of the ground and across the border, rare earths, and we can do that, I say, just as long as we sell them beyond the U.S. as well.
So there's a lot of legislators here and a lot of leaders from business across the many districts, or I should say regions. Leadership is actually is so important right now. Given the changes in how fast the speed of change in the world is now, is there anything you would share with this group in terms of insights or perspective?
Just on leadership generally, geez, I give a whole speech on that. So,
but maybe just the legislators, because things are, even when you think about when you first got elected prime minister, the technologies and the pace, things have changed so much. And
well, look, and look, the world has changed so much. What's really changed, even since I left office, the degree to which this is now a social media dominated political environment. And a lot of people, by the way, I give a long talk on social media and politics. A lot of people think or believe that, this social media has made politics just so much more complicated and public opinion so much more difficult. I don't really think that's true. I think what social media has done is forced us to face how complicated political opinion actually is. We went for generations where, essentially, whether it was horse and buggy or radio or television, we had one-way systems of communication. And now with social media, it is it's kind of fully integrated. Institutions just don't communicate to the public communicates back, the public can create its own networks overnight. And I just think a lot of what we're seeing in public opinion reflects the complexity that institutions were able to mask, and they're no longer able to mask. And there's no point bemoaning it. There's no point bemoaning that people have complex and contradictory views, or that they're in their own isolated worlds. I think it's always been that way. We just have to find better ways of dealing with it. I will say this to legislators. If I can just say one thing, as a former PM, and look, I don't feel this so much, but when I talk to people who were former leaders of countries or, ministers, legislators, the biggest single regret that people have is that they didn't do as much as they wanted to do. And in some cases, to be really blunt, there's a lot of people who are really good at just managing politics, getting elected, but when they look back, they didn't really do much of anything. And so, look, we all know if you're in the business of politics, and especially now with the complicated social media environment, political management is complicated. It takes a lot of time, but just make sure you're taking your chances, providing leadership, and seeing the opportunities to actually get something done that you know needs to be done. Because that is really, in the end, you're not gonna look back and say, boy, I had 100 good fundraising meetings and another 150 good meetings with, or 1,000 meetings with interest groups, et cetera. When you look back, you're gonna say, what you're gonna take solace from is, what are the things I got accomplished? So keep that in mind always.
That's great advice. You got a lot accomplished in your time as Prime Minister. In reflection, is there something you go, oh, I wish I was able to do that? Yes. Look, I have to say that I never felt as a government that we were ever inactive. I think we always had a busy agenda and we were always pushing forward. Certainly when I look back, there are things I spent time on I shouldn't have, or, didn't work out. Other things I wish I got done. But look, even if you did a lot, there's always going to be, you wish you could do more, wish you could do more. But at some point you just, the reality is life moves on. Look, one of the things it was very interesting. How I got back, I was in politics when I was young. I left, and then I had an opportunity in 2001 to jump into my party's leadership race and become leader when it, hadn't been really in the cards. And when I did that, I promised my wife a couple of things. One of them was, I said, look, when it's over, when we know we've gone as far as we can, and by the way, we didn't think at that point I'd ever become Prime Minister, but once it's clear we've gone as far as we can, we'll walk away and we'll never look back. And I will not do what I've seen too many leaders and former politicians do: spend their lives trying to build legacy, settle scores, fight about ongoing issues. You just go back to the extent you have to, being an analyst, and you kind of try and move on. And so, there's lots of other things I like to do. I don't often find, I have to be honest, I don't often find myself saying, geez, I wish I were there now. But there's one or two times where I'd say, if I were there, I could actually get that fixed. But those are exceptional times. My life now, people say, what's it like? Well, I have a lot less stress. I make a lot more money. That's what that's what it's like. Knowing what you know now, is there a piece of advice you would give your younger self?
Yes, two pieces of advice. One, which would probably be very particular to me, having become the leader of the country. And that was that because, and I know nobody believes this, they think nobody becomes Prime Minister without having a plan to become Prime Minister all along. But if you look at my career path, I think it's pretty hard to say, boy, that was a plan to become Prime Minister. Those Canadians who know what it was know what a strange route it was. But the consequence of that was, although I was hardworking and disciplined, I really hadn't trained myself in some of the character attributes that are necessary for leadership. So when I became a national leader for the first time, it was a difficult adjustment that I was not psychologically prepared for. And you know, maybe it was a good thing that I wasn't walking around all those years with delusions of being prime minister, but yeah, I would have, if I'd known that was going to happen, I would have prepared myself better, and it was a rough adjustment for a few years. The other thing, though, I would say is this, and look, I don't think I'm saying anything that's unusual. When I was young, you know, although I was conservative, I mean, I was, you know, when I say idealistic is the wrong word, I was impatient, not just idealistic, but impatient, and most important of all, not sufficiently understanding and forgiving of human frailty, which I think is the real problem with idealists and, quote, zealots. It's not that it's wrong to have ideals, but what's wrong is to see yourself and maybe your team as, you know, totally kind of dedicated to ideals, and other people as somehow flawed because they are not the same way. I mean, we are people, we're complicated. Politics is complicated. Everybody has their own perspectives and their own interests. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't have ideals, but ideals can't just bulldoze over people. They have to understand that, you know, especially when you're talking about governing people, it's about governing in their interests and from their perspectives. And you've got to understand that it cannot be just about you and your ideals. And I think when I was young, I was just not sufficiently accepting and forgiving of other people's perspectives and frailties, for that matter.
A couple questions have come up on AI. The OECD talks about AI has the potential to transform international trade and international business. Maybe some perspective on AI.
Yeah, a little bit. And I'm involved with, you know, several investment firms that are in the tech world and in the AI business. I don't know that I can answer specifically. I mean, there are things. I'll give you an example of trade. There's a company we're involved with called Ultra. It's now split into a number of segments. But a lot of people don't realize, like, what percentage, you know, we talk about national security goods, what percentage of world trade is inspected? It's 1%. It's less than 1%. It's 1%. So this particular company, Ultra, has developed systems whereby looking at manifests and doing background checks, et cetera, it can help identify the containers you probably should be looking at very carefully to see what's actually in them. So there's things like that. I think this is just going to be overwhelmingly beneficial. All I will say is this, and look, it's going to cause rapid, I don't think it's going to cause mass unemployment, but it's going to cause rapid changes in the workforce. And, but just to realize, you know, this is my take. I know that others don't agree with me. But, you know, I was an IT professional a very long time ago. I just think the whole term artificial intelligence is exaggerated. These are essentially computer programs that have massive data sets and massive speed and some degree of ability to create their own subsequent programming. But there is no intelligence in cognition. It's still what goes in is what comes out. And the thing to understand, what is the dangerous part of artificial intelligence is, and you see this sometimes when you do ChatGPT or other things, is that it's only as good as what you put into it. And if your data is all garbage or incomplete, artificial intelligence won't fix that. So there's always going to be the need for human expertise and human judgment.
Well, with that, I think we could be sitting here and talking for not
I
just
could
minutes.
be at least.
Well, I definitely can listen. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank the 22nd Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honourable Stephen Harper. Sure.